Then we'll go to the Canadian Business Aviation Association, Mr. Norejko, President and CEO.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today to discuss the implications of Bill C-30 on Canada's $12.1 billion business aviation sector. While this is our first appearance before the Finance Committee, the Canadian Business Aviation Association has been representing this sector for a long time. In fact, this is our 60th anniversary. Today, we represent over 400 members across the country, including corporate flight departments, flight management companies, and entrepreneurs who use aircraft to conduct and grow their business. I would like to share a few facts about business aviation and how it contributes to Canada's social and economic well-being. Despite the myth that business aviation is used exclusively by the 1%, the reality is that our sector is essential to a wide range of individuals, from business suits to construction boots. The reality is that business aviation is a significant driver of economic growth and jobs across Canada, and can be an anchor in our economic recovery. Given Canada's vast size, complex geography, and small population, aircraft have been a niche tool to deliver personnel, food and supplies, equipment, and other essential services to communities of all sizes, many of which have only the most basic airstrip for landing and taking off. Business aviation employs a wide variety of aircraft, from 4-seat propeller-driven aircraft to long-range Canadian-made Bombardier Global 7500s, as well as Boeing 737s. These time machines are used to serve our communities, get workers to remote job sites, and ensure that people can travel by air safely, efficiently, and with all health protocols firmly in place. Today, with Canada's major carriers having cancelled flights to dozens of Canadian communities, business aviation has become even more important, delivering cargo, personnel, and supplies, and ensuring that commerce and trade can continue to support local jobs and businesses. Our sector, which represents over 50,000 Canadian jobs in highly skilled and well-paying professions, gives Canada's entrepreneurs and corporations a much-needed competitive advantage. Moreover, supporting the use of these aircraft also supports Canadian aviation research, development, and manufacturing giants such as Bombardier, CAE, Pratt & Whitney Canada, de Havilland, and Diamond Aircraft, to name just a few. While there are many aspects of Bill C-30 we'd like to address, the chief among these is the luxury tax on private aircraft. The first critical point you need to know is that very few aircraft fall into the personal luxury category. They are nothing like yachts or high-end cars. They are not a lifestyle choice, but rather a safe, reliable, and efficient mode of transportation. The imposition of such a tax on aircraft used for business purposes will have a number of downstream negative implications for safety, sustainability, and for the people, businesses, and communities that rely on our aircraft. With the cost of a new tax to consider, operators will be incented to hold on to aircraft that are older and less sustainable. This would be unfortunate, as business aircraft are the most technologically advanced and sustainable aircraft in production, and this would add to Canada's overall effort to reduce our carbon footprint. Moreover, this tax would have the perverse effect of incentivizing operators to purchase and register aircraft in other countries. Dampening demand for new made-in-Canada aircraft sales has an implication also for Canada's aviation talent pipeline, as you'll hear from my colleague from the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association. The negative impacts will also be felt by non-aviation Canadian businesses that rely on aircraft as a business tool, all the way from construction and mining to the C-suite of Canadian corporations. It is our view that any benefits in imposing this tax are far outweighed by the costs. Compared with other items the luxury tax will apply to, the revenue brought in by aircraft is projected to be limited. According to the Parliamentary Budget Office, the totality of this tax on vehicles, yachts, and aircraft will generate $150 million per year. The bulk of that, 70%, is anticipated to come from vehicle sales, and the remainder from boats and aircraft. Therefore, we're looking at tax revenues from the sale of aircraft of less than $15 million per year. Moreover, this tax is unfair and unsupportable, as Canadian taxes such as GST and applicable PST are already applied to the purchase of aircraft, while the personal use of an aircraft is already recognized as a non-deductible taxable benefit to the individual. As well, the Income Tax Act does not specify or limit the type or size of aircraft. An airplane of any size can be used for business purposes. The fact the Income Tax Act makes no distinction on the type of aircraft that can be used for business purposes directly contradicts the budget's definition of personal. Our time today is limited, so we won't have the opportunity to detail the many ways that government and the business aviation community can work together to build back Canada's economy. I hope to share some of these ideas with you when we get into the question and answer period. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much for appearing on fairly short notice.
Mr. Norejko, you talked about the downstream impact that this 10% tax is going to have on the aviation industry. You also talked about how contractors and business folks supply northern remote Indigenous communities solely through the use of smaller aircraft. And can you elaborate a little bit more on what you see as some of the downstream impacts to the aviation industry of this 10% tax that's being proposed?
Absolutely, and I appreciate the question, Mr. Chair. So the thing I would raise here is just the idea that as we've seen through the pandemic, what we've come to see with the reductions of service is that the ability to visit Canadians across the communities where they live, coast to coast to coast, has been impacted. And so the decision of a 10% tax just makes the business decision to acquire these aircraft that much more difficult. And what it does is it puts to question the ability for our businesses, our employees, and personnel in those communities to interact. A great example is, as part of the pandemic, we were asked, and our industry stood up to help recover and repatriate Canadians from points all across the globe. We've had business aviation providers flying PPE to communities in the north, whether they're related to oil and gas, whether they're related to just communities that are in need. And so this critical asset, I mean, we joke and we call it a time machine, but what it is, it does exactly that. It returns time to those individuals, to those corporations. And in this case, we're seeing very much that the ability to connect with the communities across this country is being impacted. And this is where our business aviation operators are able to fill that gap and keep those Canadians connected and our corporations busy with economic activity.
Very much, Mr. Chair. My next questions are for Ms. Gervais and Mr. Norejko. The context of this so-called luxury tax is that many countries have adopted wealth taxes, and Canada has not been the exception in terms of the profits that we've seen in certain sectors during this pandemic. In fact, a few dozen Canadian billionaire families have increased their wealth by about $80 billion. So what most countries have done, many countries have done, is put into place a wealth tax. And that's certainly what many Canadians were calling for in this budget. Instead of the wealth tax, which the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer said was a legitimate tool and would have brought in billions of dollars of support, the government seems to be spinning around this so-called luxury tax. And in a sense, it seems to be making your industry a scapegoat for what really should be a broader fiscal taxation approach that the government has not put into place. So I'm wondering what the impact is of targeting your industry and your pilots and owners, when what the government should have done is actually put into place a broader wealth tax that certainly, for those who've benefited the most from the pandemic, would have actually been a much more fair and equitable approach. Do you feel targeted, and do you feel this makes any sense? And what is the impact of this government? What is political spin on this tax that seems so misguided?
So what I would add first, and I appreciate the question, with respect to the luxury tax, we need to understand the impact to the industry. You know, business aviation as a whole generates on average 33 million in GDP for the country every single day. Canadians that are employed in the business aviation sector earn on average $95,000 per year. So we've got an employee base. When you look at the provinces where our employers typically, or where these employees are based, we talk about Quebec or just under 11,000 jobs. In Ontario, over 5,000. Alberta, over 2,500, and in BC, 2,300. And so the potential impact here is looking at the impact to businesses as a result of these changes. When you look at manufacturers such as Bombardier, CAE, Pratt & Whitney, just to name those few, they're critical for how we connect across the globe. We know that a line that we'll use is, business, we need to move at the speed of business. So whether it was earlier the conversations around tourism and the requirement for a consistent plan, the challenge to the luxury tax is that while we have in place today, and I think as the question alluded to, GST and PSD, we have, if you're using the aircraft in personal use, those taxes are already contemplated, and the Income Tax Act states what aircraft can or couldn't be used, and that definition is sufficient. So on balance, the luxury tax does hurt the Canadian industry, the employees involved, and the businesses that need to stay connected around the globe.
Ed?
Well, thank you. I'll ask my first question to Mr. Norejko. I want to agree with Mr. Julian. We rarely do, but in this case, quite frankly, if the target was the wealthy, all that this Liberal government has done is inflict massive unintended collateral damage on an industry that can't afford it in the middle of a pandemic. Especially for $15 million of revenue, tax revenue, perhaps. Have you reached out to the government to discuss your concerns about the budget that's been tabled and whether there's a way of perhaps reversing course on this?
I appreciate the question. Thank you. So we have, and in fact, when I believe it was the election platform in 2019, there was some language that first came through about luxury tax and specifically about aviation. We initially consulted with government back then, and then it went away. But this most recent sort of resurgence of it is the next component that we've needed to address. We have reached out. I think all of the pressures as it relates to COVID, as our colleagues from tourism in Quebec have indicated, the focus around COVID and building a plan that gets people moving again safely has been critical. But to date, there haven't been any sort of substantive discussions with respect to budget. We understand there's expected to be a backgrounder on this luxury tax, but there's too many questions in the air. And again, it goes back to that $15 million of potential revenue compared against the cost to the Canadian economy and the jobs across the country is frankly too much to bear.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Norejko, you mentioned that this is going to impact business suits to construction boots. And you said actually very few of these aircraft fall into the personal luxury dimension. And you also said that this is going to incent them to hold on to their older planes, which means we will not be reducing our carbon footprint, and that people will probably purchase and register elsewhere. I wonder if you can explain to me, you said that there was no distinction made between personal and commercial. Could you broaden out on that?
Sure, and I appreciate the question. So with respect to personal, I mean, the way it was presented, there is still some room for interpretation with respect to certain commercial activities. There's language that states aircraft under 39 seats don't qualify. And what we're trying to recognize is that it's the importance of not just the industry within Canada, that is to say aviation and aerospace, the importance in the research and development, those things that go on. When we can celebrate on the matter of sustainability, when we talk about the first to use winglets, 1977 business aircraft, when we talk about composite technology, first to use that business aircraft. So when we go to this definition, that's still some of the work that's required, perhaps a backgrounder that's put out. But in the end, what needs to be recognized is that for the amount of revenue extracted from this tax on aircraft, the cost associated to the Canadian economy far outweighs any benefit from the potential revenue that we would extract.
Yes, that's a really shocking statement.